In a quiet district of Stockholm, which locals habitually called Atlas due to its proximity to the industrial giant of the same name, the spring of 1932 was unusually unsettling. In the air, permeated with the smell of damp cobblestones and industrial coal, hung a premonition of something inexplicable. On May 4th, as twilight slowly began to descend upon the narrow streets, one of the doors in house number 9 on Sankt Eriksplan Street remained closed for too long. It was the door to the apartment where 32-year-old Lilly Lindeström resided. A woman whose lifestyle implied constant movement and visits from guests had suddenly disappeared from her neighbor's sight. The landlady's persistent knocking on the wooden panel yielded no results, only a hollow echo reverberating through the empty corridor. When the police finally entered, they expected to find traces of a common domestic incident. But reality turned out to be far more frightening and strange. The room was in perfect order, which dissonated with the motionless body of the hostess lying face down on the bed. At first glance, it seemed she was simply sleeping, but the silence in the room was absolute, almost palpable. On the kitchen table stood a modest appliance, and next to it, an ordinary ladle, which, as it turned out later, would become the key and most sinister detail of this case. The inspectors, accustomed to the harsh reality of Stockholm's outskirts, did not yet know that they had encountered a mystery that would not be solved even 100 years later, leaving behind only a cold whisper in the archives and a legend of a creature feeding on the very essence of human existence. The city in the early 30s of the 20th century was a bizarre mixture of old European staticity and rapidly advancing industrialization. Sweden, having successfully avoided participation in the Great World Conflict a decade earlier, tried to maintain a facade of prosperity, but the global economic crisis had already begun to seep through the borders. The Atlas district was the embodiment of this transformation, a place where workers, small shopkeepers, and those trying to survive in the shadow of huge factories lived. Lilly Lindeström was part of this complex social organism. She led a life that society at the time preferred to ignore, engaging in private visits and receiving guests in her small apartment. It was a job full of risk and secrets, requiring caution and the ability to read people. In those years, Stockholm was considered one of the safest cities in Europe, where the police knew every pickpocket and serious offenses were extremely rare. That is why the event on Sankt Eriksplan caused such a tectonic shift in public consciousness. People suddenly realized that the walls of their cozy apartments were not a reliable protection against the darkness that could hide under the guise of an ordinary passerby or a casual client. The initial inspection of the crime scene baffled the investigators. Lilly had been deprived of life professionally and quietly, with no signs of struggle, which indicated either deep trust in the visitor or his incredible physical strength and swiftness. However, the strangest thing was discovered during a detailed study of the body's condition and objects in the room. Forensic doctors of that time, having only basic analytical tools, recorded a catastrophic loss of vital fluids in the woman's body. But no corresponding traces were found on the bed or floor. It seemed as if the crimson essence had been carefully collected and removed. It was then that Inspector John Berg's gaze fell on that very ladle lying on the table. Traces were found on its edges, indicating that the item had been used to consume liquid. At this moment, the word that would later be picked up by all newspapers, vampire, was uttered for the first time in the police department's offices. This was not an artistic exaggeration to attract attention. It was the only logical attempt to explain what had been seen. The criminal not only committed the irreparable, he performed a certain ritual, the the meaning of which eluded the rational understanding of Swedish detectives in the first half of the 1930s. The investigation hit an invisible wall. Despite the numerous fingerprints found at the scene, the fingerprint database at that time was extremely limited. It included only those who had already had problems with the law, and Lilly's visitor apparently was clean. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people in the Atlas district, trying to reconstruct the events of that evening. Neighbors recalled a tall man in a dark coat entering the building, but such descriptions fit half of Stockholm's male population. The problem was that the Atlas district was a thoroughfare, constantly bustling with factory workers and sailors from the port. The identity of the criminal remained blurred, like a silhouette in a thick fog. The police worked around the clock, using all available methods, from embedding agents in the working environment to carefully studying the victim's correspondence. It turned out that Lilly was very careful. She kept a diary where she encrypted the names of her guests, but entries for the last 2 days before the incident were missing, as if someone had deliberately removed them. Lilly Lindeström's inner world, hidden behind the external facade of her profession, turned out to be much more complex and tragic than investigators could have imagined. Was dictated not by a thirst for easy money, but by the harsh necessity of maintaining a habitual level of dignity. She tried to surround herself with beautiful things, to maintain perfect order in her home, as if this could protect her from the chaos of the external environment. Those who knew her intimately spoke of her kindness and a certain naivete. She believed that if she was honest with her clients, they would reciprocate. This inner conviction, perhaps, became her main vulnerability. On that fateful evening, she likely let into her home a man who was not simply seeking company, but who carried a deep psychological pathology. The conflict between her yearning for human warmth and the icy calculation of a predator became the central drama of this case. The criminal, whoever he was, possessed a specific mindset. He acted methodically, without excessive emotions, transforming the act of aggression into a kind of meal. This points to a deep internal deformation of personality, to a need for dominance and the possession of another person's vital force in the most literal sense. For Stockholm at that time, this case became a clash of two realities. On the one hand, rational, Protestant Sweden, believing in science, progress, and social order. On the other, ancient, almost primitive fears, revived in the center of the modern capital. The ideological conflict lay in the impossibility of fitting what happened into the framework of ordinary crime. Eliminating a person for profit, that's understandable out of jealousy also. But taking a life for the consumption of vital fluid, that challenges the very essence of human civilization. This event stirred up layers of the collective unconscious, reminding people of times when the forests of Scandinavia were considered the abode of dark spirits. The urban legend of the Atlas vampire was born instantly because it gave people at least some explanation, however irrational. Society faced a paradox. In a world where airplanes were already flying and giant turbines were working, a subject appeared acting according to the laws of ancient myths. This sowed a seed of doubt in the reliability of the scientific method of knowing the world, because the police, armed with all the achievements of criminology of the 30s, found themselves powerless in the face of this madness. The transformation of the case occurred decades later, when technological advancements allowed for a new perspective on the evidence. In the mid-20th century, and then again at the beginning of the 21st, interest in this story flared up with new vigor. What seemed like mysticism in 1932 received new interpretations in light of modern psychiatry and genetics. Scientists began to speak of rare forms of mental deviations associated with a clinical understanding of the need to consume certain substances to maintain one's own existence. However, the real breakthrough happened when old archives were opened for reanalysis. It turned out that biological traces had been preserved at the scene, which, in the era of DNA testing, could have provided an answer. But time is relentless. Many samples over decades of storage deteriorated or were lost during endless reorganizations of police departments. The story, which could have been solved with a single drop of reagent, once again slipped away, retaining its status as Scandinavia's greatest unsolved mystery. This realization of one's own helplessness in the face of bygone time became yet another blow to the investigation's reputation. The climax of this story came not at the moment of the body's discovery, but in the long months and years when the city lived in anticipation of a second act. Stockholm froze. Every evening incident, every fight in the port was viewed through the prism of the Atlas case. The police were forced to respond to thousands of false alarms when frightened citizens thought they saw that very man in a dark coat. But the vampire no longer showed himself. This silence was the most frightening. The perpetrator either possessed incredible self-control, or it was a one-time manifestation of his pathology, provoked by some external factor. The final clash of forces in this case occurred at the level of argumentation. One group of investigators insisted that it was a foreigner temporarily in the city. The other, that it was one of their own, a quiet neighbor who calmly drank coffee in a local shop the morning after the incident. The absence of repeated incidents allowed the case to gradually cool down, turning from a hot investigation into a subject of discussion for historians and writers. The case was never closed, and this open ending became a real curse for the Swedish law enforcement system. The resonance of the Atlas Night Dweller case is still felt today, far beyond Stockholm. This case taught humanity several important, albeit grim, lessons. Firstly, it showed that technological advancement does not guarantee safety if we encounter something that does not fit into our logical system. We can have the most modern laboratories, but if we do not understand the motives and nature of evil, we remain defenseless. Secondly, the story of Lilly Lindeström reminds us of the fragility of human life in conditions of social isolation. Her profession and lifestyle made her an ideal target, an invisible person to society until it was too late. This is relevant even today, when millions of people in megacities live in complete solitude, and their absence may only be noticed after a long time. Modern criminology grew out of cases like this, learning from past mistakes, developing protocols for preserving evidence, and methods for psychological profiling of criminals. Today we know much more about the dark sides of the human psyche, but the Atlas case remains that black swan that reminds us there is always a chance of encountering something completely unpredictable. The significance of this story for modern Sweden cannot be overstated. It has become part of the national cultural code, a symbol of the transition from patriarchal silence to an unsettling modernity. It teaches us to pay attention to details and to understand that behind every dry police report lies a living soul with its hopes and fears. We look at old photographs of Stockholm in the 1930s and see not just beautiful facades, but a space where one of the deepest human dramas unfolded. The lesson here is also that justice is not always about finding and punishing the culprit. Sometimes, justice lies in preserving the memory of the victim, in refusing to forget what happened, in a constant search for truth, even if it seems unattainable. This case makes us ponder the boundaries between the normal and the pathological, between a human and the beast that can awaken within under the influence of circumstances or morbid impulses. Concluding this narrative, we inevitably return to that very small apartment on Sankt Eriksplan. Silence still hangs in the air, once broken by the landlady's knock. We look at the empty carafe and the ladle on the table, symbols of how ordinary objects can turn into artifacts of terror. The identity of the one who left that room in the twilight of May 4th, 1932, will forever remain hidden. Was it a madman who considered himself a being of a different order, or a cold-blooded explorer of the limits of what is permissible? The answer to this question left with the last witnesses of that era, but every time we walk through the old streets of Stockholm or delve into the archives of unsolved cases, we feel a slight chill, a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They exist so that we do not forget the complexity of human nature and how important it is to preserve the light of humanity even in the darkest times. The story of the Atlas occupant is not just a detective story. It is a mirror that is terrifying to look into, but necessary to better understand ourselves and the world we live in. For many years, researchers tried to find any clue linking this event to other similar incidents in Europe. Similar cases surfaced in Germany in the 1930s. Strange occurrences in Norwegian ports were mentioned. However, each time the threads broke. The Stockholm incident stood apart with its frightening purity of execution and the absence of obvious motives. Police archives contain thousands of pages of testimonies, sketches, and plans, but they only emphasize the scale of intellectual defeat before an unknown adversary. This case became a catalyst for reforming the Swedish police, leading to the creation of special departments for investigating serious crimes and the implementation of stricter patrolling standards. It can be said that modern Swedish security was forged, in part, under the influence of this shock. Society paid a high price for its maturation, losing the illusion of absolute security. If we try to reconstruct the psychological profile of the subject based on the data that was collected later, we will see an extremely organized personality. Such a person did not draw attention to himself. He knew how to mimic an ordinary citizen, possibly had a family and a stable job. His actions in Lilly's apartment were not chaotic. He knew what he was doing, and more importantly, he knew how to leave unnoticed. This indicates a high level of intelligence and possibly preliminary planning. He could have observed the building for several days, studying Lilly's schedule and that of her neighbors. This was not an impulsive act of rage. This was the execution of a task dictated by his inner world. It is such criminals who are most dangerous to society, as they cannot be identified by external signs of social degradation. They are part of the system, its inconspicuous and deadly elements. Reflecting on Lilly Lindeström, it is important to remember that she was not just a statistic in a police report. Her life had moments of joy. She had friends who tried to help the investigation, risking their own reputations. Her story is the story of thousands of women of that time, caught in the vice of circumstances. She tried to save face, to be a professional in her field, and it was her desire to perform her duties to clients diligently that led her to face danger alone. In that era, women of her circle lacked proper legal protection, making them easy prey. The incident in Atlas became a powerful impetus for discussions about women's rights and the need for social support for those on the margins of life. This event forced authorities to look differently at security issues in disadvantaged areas and at the role of the police in preventing similar incidents. Thus, the Atlas vampire case is a multi-layered narrative where personal tragedy intertwines with global changes in society. It serves as a reminder that history does not always provide answers to the questions we ask. some events remain in the shadows to serve as a warning to future generations. We can study details, analyze prints, and build theories, but ultimately, we are left with the incomprehensibility of human behavior in its extreme manifestations. This is the main intrigue and the main bitterness of this case. Stockholm continues to live. The Atlas district has long changed. Modern office centers have grown in place of old factories. But the memory of that spring night of '32 still lives in the old brick walls, reminding us that the truth is always somewhere near, but sometimes it prefers to remain unrecognized. In conclusion, it is worth noting that each new generation of researchers brings its own tools. In the 21st century, attempts were made to use computer modeling to reconstruct the appearance of the criminal based on witness descriptions and indirect evidence. Digital maps of the movements of possible suspects were created. These efforts show that the human mind is not ready to tolerate the existence of white spots in history. It is vitally important for us to close this gestalt, find a name, and put an end to it. But perhaps the power of this story lies precisely in its incompleteness. It forces us to continue the search, improve methods of cognition, and be more vigilant towards those around us. It teaches us that reality can be far stranger and more frightening than any fiction, and that our understanding of the world is just a thin crust of ice over an abyss of the unknown. Returning to Lilly's image, we see her as a symbol of an era that has passed, leaving behind unanswered questions. Her apartment on Sankt Eriksplan, which became the scene of this drama, is now an ordinary residential premises where people go about their daily lives, unaware of the mystery hidden within these walls. This emphasizes the cyclical nature of life and time's ability to heal wounds without erasing scars. The story of Atlas remains in the annals as an eternal reminder that around every corner, something capable of forever changing our perception of humanity and the boundaries between good and evil may hide. We continue this path of knowledge, carrying the burden of the past and the hope that someday the light of truth will still shine on the dark streets of old Stockholm. In this context, the 1932 case appears not merely as an archival document, but as a living organism, continuing to influence contemporary culture. It inspires writers to create noir novels, directors to shoot thrillers, and historians to search for new documents. This case has become part of the world heritage of criminology, an example of how a single event can change the trajectory of an entire industry's development. It reminds us that behind every professional action of a police officer or doctor lie the values upon which our civilization is built. And as long as we continue to discuss, research, and remember, Lilly Lindeström and her interrupted journey do not remain forgotten. This is our way of paying tribute to a person whose life became a key to understanding many important things, even if this key never opened the main door. We can only guess what Inspector Berg was thinking when he closed the case file for the last time. Perhaps he felt the same thing we feel now, a mixture of disappointment and awe before the mystery. He understood that he had done everything possible, using the means of his time, and passed the baton to us. And we, armed with the technologies of the future, continue this search. Perhaps in some laboratory right now, an analysis is taking place that will finally tie all the threads together. And while Stockholm sleeps, and the shadows on Sankt Eriksplan fall just as they did 100 years ago, reminding us that history is always near, breathing down our necks, waiting for us to be ready to learn its last secrets.